afternoon, and welcome to the Office for the Advancement of Research's second book talk of the fall 2023 season. This talk features CUNY's own Felicia Arriaga, who is an assistant professor in the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College. Felicia will be talking about her book, Behind Crimmigration, ICE, Law Enforcement, and Resistance in America. Felicia's research focuses on race and ethnicity, immigration, and crimmigration, or the criminalization of immigration policy and procedure, aka la polimigra. As a public sociologist, she highlights the intersection of criminal justice accountability, transparency, reform, and abolition. In her groundbreaking book, Behind Crimmigration, ICE, Law Enforcement, and Resistance in America, Felicia sheds light on the impact of federal immigration enforcement programs, revealing the collaborations between local law enforcement and immigration authorities in the burgeoning immigrant haven of North Carolina. And Felicia will be joined here, I believe, by Janae Cawthon, Executive Director of the nonprofit Families for Freedom. But we will introduce Janae when she arrives.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for the invitation to be here today. As Dan mentioned, Janae will be joining us in just a bit, and Families for Freedom is an organization that I started to volunteer with when I got here to New York City. I just moved in January to New York City, but I had known about Families for Freedom for a long time before that, and Janae and I will get to talk about why exactly the work of Families for Freedom is so important when we're talking about this specific topic called crimmigration. And so Dan did a little bit of an introduction to what that means, but this is the cover of the book, Behind Crimmigration. Just as a reminder, crimmigration is what we often call the criminalization of immigration law and procedure, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means specifically in this context. Next slide, please. Great. So I also just wanted to talk a little bit about the beginning of this book, how I got into this in the first place. And so I'm just going to read what's on the screen for you as sort of the context to why I was interested in this topic. So in the fall of 2017, as I drove down I-85 South to Charlotte, North Carolina, I noticed a van pulled over on the northbound side of the highway with 2 police cars behind it and 7 individuals, all of whom looked to be Latino, walking away from the van. I took the next exit and circled back to ask them, one young woman, 5 men in their 20s, and an older man in his late 30s to early 40s, ¿necesitan ayuda? Did they need a ride anywhere or some help? As I drove them to the closest hotel, the Roadway Inn and Suites, I learned that the driver of the van had been pulled over for speeding. He was a legal permanent resident who was eventually arrested for not having a driver's license. And I also learned that they all had recently crossed the US-Mexico border, intending to meet family in Maryland and in New York. Hours later, I dropped off the older man in Charlotte with his family members, and I anxiously hoped that the other 6 would be picked up at the hotel, where they all waited for a ride from the young woman's family, in hopes that they would eventually reach their intended destinations. After that particular experience, I was already in the field doing research on this particular topic. But after cleaning out my car, I also found a prayer card that they had left in my car, which, if you know anything about migrants who are coming to this country at this point in time, many of them only come with what they have on their backs, right, or have maybe one bag of clothes. And so for me, this is a reminder that I keep with me that why I do this work is because there's a very human aspect of working with migrants and working with people who have are coming from different countries. So I keep this with me as that reminder, and I'm sure that it kept some of those people full of hope as they made that journey across the border too and continued on throughout North Carolina. I start with that story because this are some of it was a very sort of coincidence, right, that I sort of happened upon them as I was driving in North Carolina, and at the same time, I come from a mixed status family, meaning that members of my family are undocumented, and so the people that I picked up were in some ways very similar to my family's experience. I grew up in a farm working household. My family migrated from North Carolina to Florida until I started kindergarten, and I grew up most of my life in Western North Carolina. And as I mentioned before, I just moved to New York City in January. So for me, this is a very personal topic. And one of the things that Janae and I will get to talk to you all about is why it's important for us to really start at that position of what's the personal relationship, and then to think about what are the policy solutions, right? So very much some of our personal stories can lead us to driving or pushing for different kinds of policy and social changes. You look to the next slide. So if you're interested in the book, this is just a breakdown of the chapters. The first chapter really focuses on why I focus on North Carolina. Part of this is because I grew up in North Carolina, so it's sort of an obvious one. It was in my backyard. I was interested in the policies around me and my family. Chapter 2 focuses on really thinking about what do we mean when we say ICE collaboration and local ICE collaboration. And so there's a song by the group Santa Cecilia that talks about ICE is loose in the streets, and meaning that whenever I started looking at this particular local immigration enforcement partnership in North Carolina, the fear in the community was that ICE was everywhere, and it wasn't necessarily ICE officers, it was actually sheriff officers. But if you can imagine people coming to this country without the context of what does this uniform mean, for them, they started to associate ICE with the local law enforcement officers. And I'll talk a bit more about the specific law enforcement agents that I look at because they're a little different than what we would think of as like the NYPD, right? So there's a little bit of a different context in other parts of the country too. Chapter 3 really focuses on how these particular local programs that are called 287G programs, which are a very specific partnership between ICE and local law enforcement, how they persist in some of these counties that I was studying in North Carolina, like how do they continue on, given that there is pushback often against these programs, especially from immigrant communities. But I was interested in really thinking about the local government agencies and how they were actually helping to maintain this kind of local ICE collaboration. Chapter 4 goes a bit more into thinking about who's responsible for these programs continuing. And so the North Carolina context is a little different again from New York City. North Carolina, at least the community I grew up in, was predominantly white. And so a lot of the politicians were white community members. And so I, when I was doing interviews with them, really tried to push on their understanding of what was going on. And so race scholars refer to this, particularly Charles Mills was this race scholar that I draw from, as a collective amnesia, meaning that they didn't think that this local partnership existed anymore. And if you're an immigrant, you knew that it did because some of your loved ones were being deported. Versus if you were a white person who was in local government, it wasn't necessarily something that directly impacted you, and so you're able to move on with your life without even having to think about this particular local partnership. Chapter 5 really dives into these two places in North Carolina, where Charlotte, North Carolina is, which is one of the bigger cities, and Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where our state capital is. And looking at where immigrant communities, along with other criminal justice advocates, came together to really get rid of the ICE relationship with their law enforcement agency. So this particular title, this chapter is titled Melting ICE, meaning getting rid of that particular partnership. And then the last one is really thinking about where, as I mentioned before, where does ICE and local law enforcement end? Where does that collaboration end? But where does it also continue? And so in Spanish, la migra, la policía, la misma porquería. We have a very loose translation in the book, but if you speak Spanish, you know that this is not the actual translation, which is ICE, the police, the same bullshit, although it would literally be translated a little bit more vulgar. So the last chapter is really meant to sort of think about, like, what is going on, right? How do we sort of separate these agencies? And is it even possible to do that? So that's sort of a call to action based on some of the research that I was doing, but also the same, I think some of the similar research that in conversations and community work that Families for Freedom, some of the community-based groups that are mentioned in the book, that they're really struggling with, right? It's like, how do you advocate for changes when you're not actually entirely sure if there is a partnership or there isn't a partnership with federal agencies at the same time. So you can go to the next slide, I think. And then, yeah, we'll stay here. So again, North Carolina, I grew up in North Carolina. I was very interested in sort of how it sort of was operating in North Carolina. But North Carolina also, like many places in the South, had a really a quick increase in the Latinx immigrant population. And so it's also sort of important to think about that while New York City has traditionally been known as like an established immigrant community, meaning that immigrants have been coming here for a long time, other places in the South have not necessarily had that history, right? And so when we think about immigrant integration or incorporation, we often think about that places like New York City, San Francisco, LA, because they've had a lot longer to really think about how do we support immigrants, that we expect that there should be services for that population. Versus in newer places like the South, we don't necessarily see that completely being the case. And so that's why I was also interested in thinking about North Carolina as a case study to think about parts of the South, but as I sort of talk more about in the book, what I found is that some of those partnerships operated similarly, even if it was outside of the South. So one of the things that I'm interested in studying now that I've moved here to New York is really thinking about places outside of New York City, but places like Long Island, right? So other places that might be more rural in comparison to New York City, who are governed in some ways and have law enforcement entities that are sheriffs and not necessarily like the NYPD, right? So this is some of the comparative work that I'm interested in tackling as I go. One of the other things that was really, I think, unique about North Carolina too is that the sheriff that I started to look into, which again, the sheriff is the law enforcement agent, the main sort of official who is elected, but who also runs the jail in in counties, particularly in the South, but across the country. If most jails are run by sheriffs, and not necessarily in the same way that again New York City is structured. And so there's a sheriff in Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, who was pretty instrumental in actually moving forward these local ICE partnerships, not just in North Carolina, but his name's former Sheriff Jim Pendergraft. He actually is asked to be on this national task force to try to implement these local immigration partnerships across the country. So because the sort of saying goes in some of the newspapers that I was reading for North Carolina is that he did such a good job at putting the program in place in Charlotte, in Mecklenburg County, in North Carolina, that they asked him to help do this across the rest of the country. So really an important sort of aspect of thinking about how does this grow across the country too. You can go to the next slide. And actually you can skip to, I don't have the number, slide 8. Keep going. Yeah, there you go. So if you're not familiar with North Carolina, here is a picture. This, I think maybe on your side, the darker sort of areas are places that had these kinds of local immigration enforcement partnerships. And then the places in the yellow, which I think is probably coming through as like bright yellow for you all now, were places that were interested in having this kind of local enforcement partnership. And one of the things that I found through going through these different kinds of administrative records for the local counties is that the way that they're going about implementing this was what's called a hub and spoke model, meaning that they didn't necessarily need this kind of local partnership in every county. So North Carolina has 100 counties. They didn't necessarily need that in every single county, but what they could do instead was have like a central hub. And then from there, they could just transfer immigrants from other places that were nearby, right? So the hub being the sort of middle place, and then the spokes being the other counties. And so you can see at least a little bit in this map that there's sort of a hub on the left-hand side of the state, which that red sort of county is where I grew up, Henderson County. In the middle, there's a few other counties, and then sort of out further on the eastern part of the state is another hub. And so those become some of the central focus for my research, but are also some of the bigger sort of cities where people live. Mostly in this time period, this is a map from 2009, but during this time period, a lot of immigrants were coming specifically for construction jobs. But as I mentioned too, like my family, were coming for agricultural work too, which was more the case in western North Carolina and eastern part of the state too. You can go ahead. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in looking at chapter 2, and we'll get to have, I think, a bigger conversation about in just a minute, is thinking about sort of all the ways that we see ICE enforcement happening, not just in the South and sort of the North Carolina context, but as a call to action to think about where ICE is actually collaborating on a regular basis. And so one of the ways that this is framed from the, and I probably should have said, when I say ICE, I mean Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so one of the ways that sort of they're looking for immigrants at the local level in particular is through this process of trying to identify them, deciding whether or not to detain them, and then removing them if they do find that they're subject to deportation, right? And so when I started doing some of this work, I was working with community organizers in North Carolina, and they're the ones who actually, I went to a training, and they were the ones who were talking about something called the purple migra. And so if you know Spanish, that means like an octopus. And so I was just really interested because there's a community group, this sort of model came from the National Day Labor Organizing Network, who was doing this kinds of popular education around the tentacles of ICE enforcement. And so I think if you go to the next slide, this is an example. And so they would do these trainings with community members and talk about all of the different ways where they saw ICE showing up in their communities. And so this became an opportunity for communities to have this conversation about ways that this was happening even beyond what they knew, right? So some people knew that people were getting picked up because they were maybe ICE was at a local clinic, but they also knew that there was something else going on at the jails, something else going on at the prisons. And so the Purple Migra is part of chapter 2 and the way of thinking about how this popular education is important if we want to be able to talk to our communities and learn from our communities about what's going on a regular basis. I think you can go, maybe just go one more slide. And so I'm going to probably just share 2 more slides, and then I'm going to invite Janae up so we can talk a bit more about the New York City context too. So again, the context in North Carolina is a little different than sort of the New York City context. And so one of the things that I do want to make sure people leave this talk with is an understanding of how some of the community members then were able to understand what's going on in their communities when it comes to ICE enforcement, and then use that to turn some of those efforts into political campaigns against these elected officials who continued to keep the program around that they didn't want to see in their communities anymore. So we have at the national level these different agencies. The Department of Homeland Security is where all of these kinds of ICE enforcement programs fall under. At the state level in North Carolina, and for any state, we have different laws that govern whether or not an immigrant can have access to different things, right? So in North Carolina, undocumented immigrants cannot access driver's licenses, right? That's different for New York and for New Jersey, right? And so for North Carolina, that ability to drive with a license was taken away in 2006. And so to give you an example, my dad just got his work permit, and he hasn't had a license since 2010, but it's still driven. So, right, because taking away these things doesn't mean that people don't operate and don't have to continue doing the things that they have to do on a regular basis. And so what also gets implemented is a specific kind of biometric screening within local law enforcement agencies. So if you've ever been arrested, or if you know people who have been arrested, they have to get their fingerprints taken, right? Or you have to get your fingerprints taken. And that information is then sent to multiple agencies. And so in the instance that we're looking at, it, specifically for immigrants, this kind of sharing goes to the Department of Homeland Security. And in that process, then what can be sent back to the local agency is something that's called an ICE detainer, which means that once that person, that the local agency can decide to hold that person once they're done with the criminal component of the municipality. And so the last thing I'll say about this is that one of the ways that I wanted to do this research was to really think about how did these programs start in the first place? How did these sort of relationships with ICE start? And what I found is that the county commissioners were really instrumental in ushering in this program. And so what that looks like is that they would work with the county sheriff. So the county sheriff is elected in these particular municipalities. They would work together to try to usher in this particular program. Some of these agencies also work together to actually get grant money to hold immigrants. And so it was really important to think about the relationship between all of these entities that were elected. And then for community organizers, in chapter 5 of the book, I really focus on how community organizers use this understanding that these are elected officials to try to elect new people who would then get rid of the policy. So I think you can probably go ahead to 21, but there's a bunch of pictures. Sorry. I know, that's going to be hard. Yeah, that works. So chapter 5 really focuses on how community organizations work together to try to elect a new sheriff. So because the sheriff was the person who was in charge of the jail and set this policy with local law enforcement or with ICE at the federal level, community organizers in 2 of these counties really went after the sheriff and pushed for a new sheriff to be elected, especially a sheriff who was running on a campaign that they would get rid of this ICE partnership in the first place. And so in 2 of those counties, they ran a bunch of different kinds of local campaigns. Some of them did a bunch of yard signs, which in the North Carolina context is very common to have these kinds of yard signs. What isn't common, though, is to point out the really bad policies that that sheriff had. And so some of these yard signs have like a circle and then a sort of a slash through it and say, vote out this person, right? So this was a tactic that not many community organizers were doing at the time. And so this is just a representation of some of the kinds of campaigns that community members were running to really raise awareness about what the sheriff was doing and to then push for a candidate that would actually get rid of these kinds of local ICE partnerships, because that was really important for them in their communities. So in 2 of the counties in 2018, a new sheriff was elected, and that sheriff immediately got rid of these local ICE partnerships, and those relationships have continued with that sheriff. So this was an opportunity also for that sheriff to also have a conversation and be a community alongside these different kinds of community coalitions that were created to really bring attention to these local ICE partnerships. I think the last thing that I will leave up there is, you keep on going, there is a slide with like an ICE logo on the top. And then I'll ask Janae if you're ready to come up and chat. I'm gonna leave this up here, and you're welcome to come like peruse it later on. One of the things that, again, I'm really interested in thinking about is, I was really focused on looking at sheriffs as like a site where immigration enforcement and collaboration was happening. But one of the things I think we don't often think about is where else can there be ICE collaboration. And so for scholars who are thinking about the relationship between the criminal justice system and the immigration system, this is a pamphlet training manual from a 2012 ICE training, where they specifically point out this is where we can pick up immigrants once they've passed through the criminal justice system, right? And so I often, when I'm doing trainings for community organizers, I often start with this so that we can understand that, yes, it is great that we ended this policy within the jail and we're able to shift that particular policy. And at the same time, there are all these other areas that we should think about where, or if there is ICE presence there too. And so one of the things I'm really excited about, I mentioned before, is that being able to learn from Families for Freedom for me is really important, because Families for Freedom has already been doing some of this work of thinking about not just the relationship between the carceral state or the immigration system and the criminal justice system, but also thinking about how do you support individuals who have been in both of those systems, right? So with that, I'll invite, if you both want to come, there are two chairs, but if just one of you wants to come up, you can too, so it's up to y'all. And I have your bio, so I'm gonna read a little bit. Is that okay? If we can get a round of applause for Janae, that'd be great. So Janae is the executive director of Families for Freedom. She's a second-generation Jamaican-American woman who has made New York City her home and community. Since childhood, Janae has wanted to work with and meets the needs of underrepresented minorities across the country, and was able to start doing so by earning a BA in liberal arts and social work. Although she faced many immigration-related challenges throughout her life, including losing her former husband to deportation during Trump's administration in 2018, Janae has always strived to support and empower others facing similar issues, as she personally believes in the equality of all people. Janae fought effortlessly against the broken system and was able to assist with her former spouse receiving a pardon in 2021, which made him eligible to return to the U.S. and be reunited with their children. Once she joined Families for Freedom in 2005, Janae was able to express this passion of social justice and welfare by advocating for immigrants around America struggling with the broken immigration system. Starting out as just an intern by representing Families for Freedom for many years at national press conferences, rallies, and justice movements, she now serves as executive director of the organization's staff and board. As Families for Freedom's current chairman, Janae has been able to extend the organization's goal of providing freedom to migrants to individuals of all races, ethnicities, and genders, as well as grow its small support group into a nationwide community. At the same time, as the co-founder of New York's New Sanctuary movements, she's provided direct services to immigrant families caught in the unjust detention deportation system, and developed immigration awareness across the New York City area. Through all these simultaneous efforts, Janae has proven to show her deep dedication to the liberation of all people and dismantling of the cruel immigration system. So thank you, Janae, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
I feel like I'm getting ready for a job interview.
Not quite. So we have just a few questions that we both wanted to chat about, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Janae, I read a little bit of your bio already, but if you can tell us a bit more about why you came to this work, why you're interested in specifically this kind of work.
Well, I grew up in Brownsville, East New York, which is one of the poorest areas in Brooklyn, and I was bullied. So being bullied, it did something to me. I remember crying a lot, growing up as a kid. And one day, my mother said, if you keep on crying and not standing up, the bully is not going to stop. So I'm not going to get, I don't want you to think I'm a monster, but this guy, he bullied me, he teased me, and he touched me in an inappropriate way. So I picked up a typewriter and I threw it at him. So after that happened, all of the bullying stopped. And they started calling me Crazy Janae. I remember going to my first protest when Yusuf Hawkins was killed back in the 80s. I was about 12 years old. And when my grandmother had us out there protesting, I was like, why would they kill him? And my grandmother said they did it because he's black, baby. And I said, wow. So I always had a love against injustices. And I reached out to Families for Freedom back in 2005. I thought I hit the jackpot. I did hit the jackpot. I met this Haitian man. He treated me so well. He just left something out of his resume. He told me that he did time in jail for selling drugs when he was a teenager. By the time I met him, he was almost 40. So I said, it's cool. He never told me that while he was doing his time, immigration came to visit him. Immigration laws were retroactive. So you have people that got convicted of minor offenses such as smoking pot, and they were deported. So I received a phone call, I remember February 3rd, 2005. He went to his probation officer because when I met him, he had just came out from serving time. He got convicted in the state of Virginia at the age of 18. They sentenced him to 33 years for a drug offense. And they didn't even actually catch him selling drugs. He was with someone who was selling drugs. And they asked him, is this your friend? He said, yeah, y'all both going down. So when he told me 33 years, I said, 33 years? I gotta do some research. And I realized Virginia is a Commonwealth state. So if you come from New York, New Jersey, you get caught in Virginia as a black or brown person, they're gonna try to hang you and make you an example out of you. Because during that time, they had the Rockefeller drug laws where they were trying to just get rid of the drugs off the street and make examples out of black and brown people, but they didn't think about the white people that was coming into our neighborhoods to buy the drugs. Fast forward, I went online, I found Families for Freedom organization to help me with his case. And I didn't know much of anything about it because I didn't know that they can run a law retroactively. That's like 65 being passed when we're in high school, and then they decide to change the law 10 years later and say, oh, you need an 80. They're not gonna come back and take our high school diploma. But unfortunately for immigrants, they will run a law retroactively against you. Families for Freedom helped me so much. I mean, from 2005 to 2018, he was put on supervision where they put an ankle bracelet on his ankle. Keep in mind, this man is now he's 53 now. During this time, he was in his 30s and 40s paying for a mistake he made as a teenager. So I was determined to help others because when it happened, I felt alone, I was scared. We already had built a family. We had a child at the time together, and I would refuse to allow my family to be separated by a broken immigration system. So I started reaching out to all the elected officials, and at that time I was working for the city of New York. So I was using my ties with the city of New York, stating, hey, I work for HRA. I'm a case manager, I help underserved children. Can you give me a letter of support for my family? And then it went on from there. Unfortunately, in 2018, when we all heard Trump say Haitians are from like a shithole country, they picked him up on January 3rd when he was on his way to work, and they deported him on Martin Luther King Day. I never gave up. In 2010, while he was going through these changes, I said, I'm going to try to apply for a pardon because I heard a pardon can help. So people kept saying, you're not going to get a pardon from Virginia. But that pardon was still there, and I never received the decision. So I spoke to his attorney. I spoke to the attorney in 2018. I said, why don't we try to push that pardon from 2010? So when I called Virginia's Secretary's office, I identified who I was, and she said, Janae, we haven't even gotten to your case. So that gave me leverage to build more support for his pardon. And they showed his good leadership. He hasn't been arrested, committed any illegal activity since he was a teenager. So I even had my kids write letters, and they did video, and if you can Google my name, you'll see my children are 25, 20, and 16. Wow. You can see them when they were young, very young. My daughter, she wasn't even thought about when her dad was going through this. Our son was only a year and a half. When I reached out to Ralph Northam, I left a voicemail. I said, I'm a mother. You can go home to your wife. Why is it that my kids are without their dad? And I pulled at his heartstrings and showed him the visual. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I was so ecstatic when Gene called me from Haiti in October of 2021, and he said, baby, you divorced me, but I'm coming back home. I said, what are you talking about? He said, check the news. I got deported. I said, no way. I Googled it, and he got deported. But his fight wasn't over. We had to, thank you. We had to fight to get him back, paroled back to the U.S. He had some kick-ass lawyers from NYU Law School. We got him back to the U.S. He finally won his immigration hearing in April of this year. He has his green card back now. Now he's about to become a citizen. So that's what drew me to this work, because it was something personal. Thank you.
Yeah, I started with the conversation about the personal aspect of why I decided to write this book, and so I really appreciate you sharing that with folks here. I think for folks who maybe don't know much about immigration or know much about the criminal justice system, do you mind sharing, and then I'll share, why should we care about this topic, especially if maybe people don't have a personal relationship to it?
I would say that you should care because we're all mixed with something. We're all beautiful individuals. No one is 100% American, and I can guarantee that. Take your ancestry.com. You know how you can test your DNA. Immigrants are human beings just like everyone else. Immigrant keeps this world moving. We'll see immigrants doing jobs that some citizens won't do. When we go into these restaurants, who's waiting on us? 99.9% is an immigrant. And people who were born in other countries, it's hard to live in a third world country. I remember going to Haiti to visit Gene twice, and I was scared out of my mind. You see how we have this bottle of water? This same bottle of water in Haiti is like $10 US. You can't run water and drink it in a lot of countries because you'll get sick. So I feel that you should have the outlook like immigrant rights are human rights.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I was talking to Dan about earlier too is that one of the pathways that I was interested in researching and didn't quite make it into the book was also how much money goes into immigrant detention, goes into incarcerating immigrants. And that money is coming as taxpayers, right? Like that money is coming from us. And so one of the things that I used to do more in North Carolina was budget advocacy work with local community-based groups, because that was important for us to understand how much of this money is going to incarceration and how much of that specifically is coming from the federal government as reimbursements to hold immigrants, right? So if you're wanting to try to push back against this mass incarceration, against like these broader structures of carceral facilities, we have to think about where does that money come from in the first place, right? And thinking about how do we advocate for changes to budgetary policies, right? In a place like New York City, I don't think I'd tell you all that a lot of money goes to carceral facilities here, right? Goes to the police, right? Especially in this moment where that is being used in this conversation about that the migrants who are coming here, right, that services need to be cut from other areas of the budget for these migrants, right, when there isn't a conversation about cutting services to one of the biggest agencies that gets a lot of money, right? And so it is important for us to also think about, like, we have a role to play because we live in this city, right? Like in North Carolina, I lived in the community where there was an immigration enforcement partnership, and I knew that the local agency was getting money to hold immigrants, some of our community members, specifically for, as Renee mentioned, crimes that they maybe committed a long time ago, right? So I think one of the things that we wanted to hear too from you, Janae, is thinking about like, what is the current context of immigration enforcement in New York City. If you could tell us a bit more about that.
To me, to be an immigrant in New York, they make it criminal. They state that the migrants are taking resources from us. I beg to differ. I'm on leave from New York City Department of Homeless Services as a director, and I worked as a case manager. There were tons, 90% of the people in those DHS shelters, even now, are not migrants. The unfortunate situation that's going on in Gaza and Palestine, my condolences to all lives lost. The president had the power immediately after going there one day to say he's going to send $100 million to them. Why can't he send $100 million to New York City to help with the migrants? We see tons of office buildings closed due to the pandemic. A lot of people lost their business, lost their licenses. They have these affordable housing buildings where they have vacant apartments. They can put these migrants to work, just like us. They can treat them just like they treat us. They shouldn't make someone feel less than human because they were born in another country. None of us asked to be born at all. They come in here for second chances. And it breaks my heart as a mother. Right outside our office, we see children outside sitting on curbs. That's inhumane. I had a meeting the other day, and I found out that now in the DHS shelters, the case managers are calling ACS on the moms. I don't know if the group is mixed, but we've been left home as children, and we did pretty good. But you can't do that now in the DHS shelter. If you have a child that's under the age of 18, and New York City has no latchkey law, but they've given a latchkey law to migrants. If they leave their children, it can be a 14-year-old watching a 5-year-old. They call an ACS. A mom got arrested and detained because a case manager called ACS on them. And the case manager should not even be sharing her immigration status, but she did. So we have to stick together as a whole. People should be able to make wherever they landed their home. These migrants didn't ask to come here. A lot of them was trafficked, of course, they was trafficked from Texas in a political stunt. And my take on it, when they overturned Roe versus Wade and Mayor Adams went and said, hey, if you want to get an abortion, come to New York. And Texas, abortions are illegal. So now they found a way to use the migrants as employed. Throw them in New York, throw them in. They're human beings. We've heard of stories on the news where migrants commit suicide. Could you imagine you come into New York City, you see that this New York City is a right to shelter, but now migrants don't have a right to shelter. They're telling them it's 60 days and you have to leave. But that doesn't include the undocumented people that's already in shelter. They're only targeting the new arrivals, and that's wrong.
Yeah, thank you, Janae. And one of the things that I briefly mentioned too is that as I learn more about sort of the New York City, the New York State context of immigration enforcement, I do see similarities, particularly at the state level, right, of these kinds of partnerships. One of the things that is on this chart, it's a little hard to see, is that in most places still, that if you're incarcerated in the prison system or at the state level, that you do have some ICE history. If you do have some ICE history, that you potentially are going to get deported, right? I don't think many states have made a full-out law that says that partnership ends, right? And so I think while I focus on North Carolina, I'm always interested in thinking about what are the similarities across other jurisdictions, so across other counties, across other states, because I think especially at the state level, that's one place where I think we often see that people aren't willing to advocate for those people because they have been incarcerated for longer times, right? And so I think one of the things that also drew me to volunteering with Families for Freedom is because of the campaigns that y'all are working on, right? Like, you're not necessarily stepping away from cases because someone is incarcerated, and I think that that's something that's really important. It's really important for immigrant rights groups in particular to think about, like, how are we advocating for people regardless of their criminal history. And so I think maybe the last question before we open it up for Q&A from the audience is, what are some of the campaigns y'all are currently working on? and how do you, I know some of them are specifically individuals who have both immigration issues and criminal justice issues, but if you can just talk about some of those campaigns, that'd be great.
We're partners with IJN, which stands for Immigrant Justice Network, and we're trying to push for them to pass the New Way Forward Act. And the New Way Forward basically is what it says. It gives immigrants a new way forward. Not every immigrant who's at risk for deportation committed a crime per se. We have cases, and I know of individuals that came here as babies and their parents never got them citizenship. So that's a crime, being here. It's not your fault that your mom or your dad didn't get you citizenship, but they can be deported if someone calls ICE. We also have a campaign for Garfield Green. He's an amputee from Jamaica. He came here as a green card holder. He served his time. He was placed in detention, and they didn't give him the proper medical treatment. Now he's at risk of losing his last good leg because of the injustices and the lack of health care that they gave him when he's in detention. I have some of my team here, and we have some freedom cards that we're going to pass out. I would like you to scan the cards, tell your friends, sign these petitions. We all can make a change if we stick together. Not everyone is a bad person. We all make mistakes. I'm quite sure some of us got parking tickets, running red lights, cut class. Imagine if somebody kept that over your head every day, telling you you're no good, you're no good. That's wrong.
Thank you, Janae. And yes, if people from Families for Freedom want to wave their hand, just so we know. Thank you. It's a great crew of folks here. So.
They shy.
It's a great crew of folks. So we'll turn it over for folks from the audience. If you have questions for us, any comments. If it's a comment, you can keep it short so we can preference questions. That would be great. And I think Remy is going to walk around with a mic if you have any questions for us.
Don't be shy.
When it comes to getting help from Families for Freedom, like how does someone like go about it?
The team is here. We'll give you our contact information. You can call us, email us, and then we'll do what is called the intake and see what type of services you have. We currently have donations that we're distributing, so if anyone has siblings or if you have back to school supplies or you have certain needs, you can reach out to us. If we don't have it, we'll find somebody that has it.
Sorry, I'm a bit late, please. I don't know if you already answered this, but I'm no doubt in the belief that was an amazing presentation. But when it comes to sheriff's departments, how far can we get them to roll back on their policies in the same light maintain an abolitionist sort of politics as well? Now, if you answer that, I'm really sorry.
I did not answer that. Dan, can I ask you can you go back to a little star picture?
An abolition, right?
No, I think it's a good question. There you go. So I mentioned some of the sort of community-based work that I've done before. Some of that work really focuses on what is the role of the sheriff, right? So, and this is some of the graphics that we use to sort of explain, along with these other kinds of series, to do like teach-ins on what the role is. And so you can't see all of this, but at least for us, the sheriff runs the jail, the sheriff does court policing, does eviction enforcement, which I think they still do here in New York as well, working with ICE, different kinds of patrolling, all of these things. And so I think you can roll back policies if they are decreasing the reach of this entity, right? I think that at least is one of the challenges, I think, with many of the groups that were advocating for changes within the sheriff's office, is that they were working in coalition. Some of them were abolitionists, but others were not. They were criminal justice advocates who very much just wanted some kind of reform, right? And so for many of the community-based organizations that were working on specifically the issue of getting rid of this ICE partnership, to them, getting rid of this partnership was part of their abolitionist stance, right? Was trying to at least decrease the reach, decrease the risk of deportation for many of the community members. I didn't give any of the statistics, but in Mecklenburg County, across a 10-year time period, it was close to 15,000 immigrants who had been deported out of that one county. And so for them, they really saw this as an opportunity, but as also like an example of what could happen, right? So in that same county, it wasn't, they did push really hard on changing the immigration enforcement policy, but what they also had in this coalition space was a commitment to try to end solitary confinement for 16 and 17-year-olds, along with trying to put in place an oversight board for the sheriff's office. So many cities have civilian review boards as sort of this entity that is an attempt to provide some kind of advisory or oversight of police departments. In most places at the county level, those don't exist. I probably know of 3 across the whole country that actually have any kind of like community-based oversight committee. And so for the community organizations, these are things that they collectively put together as a way to think about how do we monitor, but then how do we also decrease the criminalization of people, right? And I think it was in some ways aspirational in many ways, because unfortunately, if you go back to that same platform that people ran on in 2018 in that particular county, only one of those 3 policies actually changed, right? And so I think that there has been in these community groups a lot of discussion about what does it mean to get one policy changed, but not the other 2, right? And where does the coalition building continue beyond that one policy? So I think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge that isn't just unique to North Carolina. I think that that's many groups, right? Is what do you do when you're presented with maybe one change, but not necessarily the bigger change that you want to see, right? I think in talking with community organizers here, right, Rikers, right, closing down Rikers seems to be like the one example that, from my understanding, continues to be a challenge, right, to think through in this moment. So I don't know if that completely answered the question, but I think it's a challenge, right? I think it's a challenge. I think it very much is a challenge, but for these organizations, they agreed to at least try to push for these particular challenges, given that they had sort of different things that they wanted to see happen. I don't know, Jenny, if you wanted to answer that question too.
So in New York City, ICE agents, police officers, correction officers, those are the ones that we have to worry about. We recently, a few years back, we got ICE out of the courthouses because ICE agents will wait in family court. It can be like a husband and wife, they get into an argument, husband's aggressive, or even the wife is aggressive. Not only men get aggressive, we all get aggressive. And the case can be dismissed. Once they know that that person is undocumented, they detain them right outside the courthouse. They're not allowed to do that anymore. So I would say that we would have to push now for ACS because we have a lot of migrants that's here with young children, and case managers are using their privilege to make these phone calls to ACS against a migrant because maybe, they have heavy caseloads and they figure if they get rid of one migrant, it's going to make their caseload better. But before we went through this, I don't even want to call it a crisis because I walk down the street, I'm not tripping over people. The way they act like since the migrants are here that the streets are so crowded we can't walk, it's just a form of ignorance. Because you can't, it's like, compare it to like a vegetable. We all love French fries. You can't say you love French fries but you don't like a potato. People can't, because where does French fries come from? A potato. Migrants are human beings. I'm not fully American. My dad is Jamaican. So I've lost some foes. I'm not even gonna call them friends when they were happy that Trump won. Because how can you be happy for a person that's an anti-immigrant crusader? But he has immigrants in his own family. So it doesn't make sense. It's like an oxymoron. So we have to continue on. I'm scared to say continue voting because I'm losing faith in that part. But get involved with organizations like Families for Freedom and other organizations that fight to abolish these broken systems.
Could I ask a question? Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things that I grapple with all the time is trying to reach out, even locally, to the immigrant population. There is so much fear that we are trying to, it's like breaking through that ice, and I mean literally an ice cube, because of what the system has done to them. And I agree with you. It's like, I also feel that there's something going on against the immigrants who are so-called ethnic. I mean the brown-skinned population of immigrants. I was born and raised in this country, and I remember a time I lived in an Italian-Irish neighborhood, okay? But when they were all coming from Europe with a different complexion, they were treated much more different. Because my understanding is that once a person, especially an immigrant, gets, let's say, like you said, for detained, now they are put in the same category like all criminals. Okay, they gotta go to jail, they gotta go to a prison, they might even end up at Rikers Island, another inhumane place, okay? And it goes on and on and on. All right, so one of my main questions is, what can I do even on a local level? Because I realize that some of these immigrants may trust more someone who is not an official, okay? They may talk more to let's say, the next door neighbor who lives next to them than they would to the actual social worker, okay? They might actually open up a little bit more to maybe like the person who speaks their language, who knows something of their culture, than the actual ACS worker who's gonna appear, okay? I don't think any of them are even gonna get that type of trust. And that would be my question. How do we break through locally as the human beings that we are and try to be the real people? Sometimes it's gonna take the grapevine, you know, and we learned that when the system fails, we have to come to a point where we can help each other out then. Okay.
You're absolutely right. I would say get involved with a local group like Families for Freedom, because even myself, being a Black Jamaican woman, my team, like Sally, speaks Spanish. So I see when we're dealing with migrants that speak Spanish, I'll be like, Sally, come here. Then they feel a little safer because it's people that look like me in Sally, but Sally speaks Spanish. So they feel that they can relate to her better. Even when I was giving out my business cards, they were kind of scared to take them because of the situation. And this country has created the bad immigrant, good immigrant narrative, meaning immigrants from Ukraine don't get treated the same way like immigrants from El Salvador, and that's not fair, and it's not right. So we have to continue on, come to Families for Freedom, sign these petitions, give letters of support. We're working with a guy, his name is Robert Payton. He's an immigrant from Harlem. This man was given life in prison for a drug offense. He served 30 years. He's 57 now. We did a press conference back, I believe it was earlier this month at 26 Federal Plaza. They put an ankle bracelet on a 57-year-old man's ankle, and they told him he has 6 months to get out of here. He done transformed his life so much. A judge shows that he's a changed man. That's why he let him out. But immigration doesn't see that. Robert has elected officials like Gillibrand and Schumer contacting ICE like, don't deport this man, and they're not listening. So now his attorneys are filing a presidential pardon. So we're gonna need all of you, letters of support, signatures to show that, you know, people can change. And because if he was from the Ukraine, he wouldn't be going through that.
No.
He would have got his pathway to citizenship. They exploit migrants. I don't know if you read the story. I just found out about it recently. A security officer, which carried guns at 26 Federal Plaza, had a migrant perform oral sex on them. I'm happy that migrants spoke up. They should give that person automatic citizenship, and they should put that officer under the jail, because this makes no sense, how they treat people just because they're from another country. They're bullying, and I know I don't like bullies. So we have to stick together as one, because this is going to affect, if it's not affecting you now, it definitely will affect you later. Because I've had people who, when I was going through my situation with my former spouse, they was like, oh, you crazy. I wouldn't have. Then a couple of years later, Sinead, my boyfriend just got detained. Excuse me? You know, I helped them, but I told them, you never know. This could be one of your friends in class. You find out Maria or Stacy is undocumented and someone called ICE because they was upset. So you don't have, being in this country without the proper documentation is a crime. We have to change that. This Real ID Act that they're passing, telling us we need real IDs, that's not for citizens, that's for migrants. Because when we're looking at these trucks doing construction, we see a lot of migrants out there. They need their license to be able to take care of their families. Now they're trying to take that away. That's why they're passing that Real ID Act. So we have to advocate against injustices. You have to stand for something or you're going to fall for anything.
And I, first one, I'd like to say thank you being here, and I would really appreciate your speech, both of you. To add on to the previous question, I was wondering on an individual level, where to get involved, how do you become a concern for you?
Christiana, Sally, get busy.
Yeah, you can reach, you can definitely talk to these two in the front, and they can set you up. And I will say that this summer, at the end of the summer, I was volunteering, and I had the summer interns teaching me how to use the phone. So it was great. It was great because I was like, oh gosh, I'm not gonna use the phone. Also, there's so many other programs that Families for Freedom runs too. So one of the things that I think is amazing is that they have a free line where if you're incarcerated, you can call in and you get 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, we have a hotline that's in the detention centers. Some of the local jails and techs all over, they have a button. So I don't know what number we are, but someone spread the room. You press number 5, they call and they want to get a phone call to their family, because if they try to call their family directly, it'll be like $5 a minute. It's very expensive, but we allow them to speak to their loved ones for free.
Yeah, so there were interns teaching me how to use the phones to do that my first day there, which was just great to learn from other people. So as Janae told me, it's a learn on the job situation.
Yeah, LJT.
Hello. First, I'd like to apologize for being late, but I was teaching the class. Okay. One of my classes I teach, I also talk about private prisons. Dr. Arriaga, from your research, the immigration situation in private prisons. Are private prisons, do they like to see the folks coming across the border? Are they like, okay, well, as many as possible? So
They love it. They love it because they got that ICE contract. They love it because they're not monitored. They don't even monitor regular prisons, so they really don't monitor private prisons. And then when a person gets detained and they go into a detention center, you don't get to hug them like you would if they were in Rikers. It's behind a glass, and it's only for 20 minutes. I remember when Gene was in detention, they shipped him to some place called Salisbury, Maryland. I never heard of that place until he went to a detention center there. It was about 4 hours. I drove all the way from New York so the children can see him. I'm thinking, because I come from, unfortunately, from a family where a lot of the males serve time. And when a person is in the regular New York State correctional facility, you get to buy chips, pop popcorn, and be with your loved one. But if you're an immigrant in the detention center, you don't get to do all of those things. They make them wear them orange jumpsuits like they have mental illness, and you just speak through the phone for 20 minutes. They don't care how far you come, and they just cut the call just like that. So that's a big money maker for them.
So I don't look at private prisons as much. Mostly I'm looking at local government-run jails because, yes, everything today said, there's certain requirements on how many beds we have available in private prisons for immigrants. So there's quotas that we have. Exactly that. And then I think, yeah, so the only privatization piece that is talked about a little bit in the book is the private services, I'll use those in quotes, in local jails, right? So we also have to think about, right, like commissary, like health services. Those are typically like privatized services that are we pay for, right? Or the person who is incarcerated has to pay for. So I don't talk as much about private prisons in the book. So I'm looking at mostly local government funded, taxpayer funded types of facilities. But there might be someone in the room who could also talk about private prisons. Dan.
That's perfect timing because I also wanted to ask a question. But you know, the issue with private prisons, I think you did your finger on it. It is that those nice contracts do bring a lot of money, and eventually we're going to figure out it as well. They are going to get those beds full whether people are coming across the border or not, right? So the one thing I wouldn't lose sight of with the private prison contracts is especially this, right? Their beds are filled by interior enforcement, right? And that's really what we're talking about with the kinds of situations that Felicia and Jay are talking about. I mean, these are folks, many of them have been here for a very long time, right? And what happens with these financial incentives is that they're going to reach for whoever they can grab, right? And if that's a person who's been here for 30 years and then has an old criminal conviction from 30 years ago that they can get grabbed on, that's the person who's going to fill that bed, right? So that's how those incentive structures are really set up.
Yeah.
Good? I did, yes. So I wanted to ask you both, you're both working in the advocacy space, so I'm wondering, for those of us who are interested in advocacy, what for you are the most promising campaigns? And you can think about that as broadly as you want, nationally and locally. What's the best thing that we can put our energy behind to make a difference here? And then maybe flip that around and talk about what you think is the biggest risk that immigrants are facing right then. So let's see it from both ends.
I would speak about it in backwards terms. I would say immigrants they're in a very dangerous times now of being exploited. And I'll give you an example. I'm an immigrant woman. I'm from Ghana. Mike, he's a CEO, he's my boyfriend. I catch Mike cheating, I want to leave. Mike beats me, tells me, you leave, I'm calling ICE. So then I'm scared I'm going to stay in that situation because I don't want to go back to Ghana to be abused. So it's a very sensitive situation because when you hear the elected officials, even Mayor Adams, and he was my boy until he opened up his mouth and started talking about immigrants like that, so he's not my friend anymore. When you hear these elected officials that look like you, black and brown people talking down on you, that makes you feel hopeless. And it's hard enough, us being in New Yorkers, it's hard for us. Imagine immigrants. So they don't know where to turn, so they need organizations like Families for Freedom or other organizations, and they need you and I. We're in the process of collecting more donations because it's getting cold. They're going to need coats. They can't go to the Salvation Army in certain places like we can because they don't have the money to pay for it. So if you have any gently used coats or clothing items that you don't want, I will come pick them up in my personal car because I want to help people, because it's not fair for them to be treated, this way. And I would say to continue on to sign petitions like the New Way Forward, the Clemency Justice Act. The Clemency Justice Act is we're part of a coalition called the Clemency Coalition, but I don't speak about the Clemency Justice Act. A lot of people can have a second chance if they're given clemency. We have people that was deported for marijuana. Now you see people smoking weed right next to the police and it's nothing that could be done. We have a young man, he was deported for being an excessive fear invader. You know those guys that sell the swipes in the train? To deport someone for that is insane, but they did it. And then in his legal brief, the way they wrote it, like he was worthless to society because all he did was do that. For him to do that, he had to be looking for money. So we have to, stop turning the cheek when you see something. I'm not telling you to put yourself in danger, but if you see a migrant in distress, don't ask them if they're hungry. If you go into the store, just drop them a bottle of water, get them a sandwich. Because they can be hungry, but they're scared to ask you. They don't know how you're going to act towards them. We did an event in Brooklyn, and I got a whole bunch of the pork skins, and I'm the type of person, when you're giving out free stuff, I just collect it. I don't even need it, but I collect it. So I said, you know what, Janae, you can drive around your neighborhood, because I live downtown. And I was just giving it out to migrants. And they were so grateful to have those items. At first, they thought I was the police because I had tinted windows. And I said, hi, I'm your friend. And they just said, thank you, thank you, thank you. Do things like that. If you have if you drive, put a case of water in your trunk. Give them a bottle of water, because they have it rough out here. They really have it rough. And the times we're living in now is not nice times.
I think the sheriff campaigns to me are something that's exciting for a lot of different reasons. I think one is the ability for people to come together and really think about running local candidates, not necessarily just in the sheriff position, because there was the question about how do you advocate for this person who is at the end of the day going to incarcerate some people, regardless of if they're immigrants or not. It is a challenge. But I think learning in that process has brought people to an understanding of what this position does and the power of the position. And so some of the research that we do, or at least the research that I say that I do, is called power research, which is really trying to understand who's in positions of power and how do we dismantle that power, and or how do we put our people into those positions, right? And so I think that I do have hope and really think that people are learning from that particular learning how to campaign for those local offices. And then I think I mentioned the budget advocacy. It may sound boring. I definitely think, yes, you have to look at a bunch of numbers and understand where the money's going. But I think if you make that exciting, that can also be an area where we look at how many billions of dollars are going to, right now, different countries, right? How are we involved in military interventions across different countries? How are we involved and how much money goes to the NYPD, right, in this moment, or other carceral sites, right? So I think mentioning child services is important, because if that becomes, as Janae mentioned, right, the people that are being called to police, quote unquote, migrants, then we also have to think about how do we, as people who pay money, right, who are taxpayers, who pay into this public good, in quotes, that we're also responsible for monitoring those groups, right? We're also monitoring and holding those folks accountable. And so the budget advocacy to work to me is always really important. And I think I'm always happy to give a budget advocacy training. There's a lot of great groups in New York City who already do this work too. And so I do find that that's something that you can do in your house, right? You can look at the budgets, you can see where the money goes, you can then advocate for that money going into something else, right? This is the divest, invest approach, really investing in services that are going to support community members. They're going to get directly to people who are most in need. So I think that that's where I see things going. I think the risk is capitalism, exploitation, like as Janae already mentioned, right? Like that's the system that we live in this country, in this moment. I think unless we figure out how to create these local economies that support us outside of that system, then that's always going to be the risk, right? It's people have to come here because of, particularly in the like Mexico case, because that's the case I know the most of, is because of our trade agreements, U.S. trade agreements with Mexico that forced rural agricultural workers into cities in Mexico and then out of cities into the United States, right? That is because of our trade agreements, and that is because of capitalism, right? So I think that those are the risks that we're up against, and it's hard, I think, to think about where do we make an intervention. But I always, when I teach my race and public policy course, I always make sure that we understand that there's like individual steps we can do, there's like institutional steps, right? Pushing your universities to make commitments about things. And then there's these like bigger structural things that are going to require all of us to be moving towards some goal, right? And so I think that the risk is what we currently live in, and the way to get out of that is through some shared collective organizing.
Okay, so I have a question about the book. You mentioned how there was a time when the election was coming up and a lot of immigrants who could vote didn't vote, and how communities aren't like reaching out to them enough. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes you try to reach out, but since in where they come from, elections are like rigged, so like they don't believe in elections at all. How do you convince them to even go to town meetings? Because they're like, go for what? Just to like hear people talking? So I'm just curious on how you can outreach them more and realize the importance that elections will make a change, hopefully, and how to get them more involved in the political aspect.
That's going to be a hard one, because when Biden and Kamala was running, they went to Miami, where there was a lot of Haitians. Matter of fact, it wasn't Biden, it was Trump. He made the Haitians convinced that he was going to do a change, and then after he got in office, he started deporting tons of Haitians. So it's hard. What I would say, I would tell them to go to the town meetings and take their citizen friends with them, and a couple of their friends that's undocumented, and just make a scene in a powerful way, like stand up and say, hi, I'm Janae. I voted for you, but you deported my uncle. Like, call them out on their nonsense and just do it in a group. And the citizens, we are the protectors, because I don't have a problem getting arrested for a good cause, but I'm not gonna allow my friend that's undocumented to get arrested, because that undocumented status can cause them to be exiled from this country. Me, I'm gonna get a disappearance ticket and probably some community service. But now I heard they're saying now when you do certain things, they try to say that you're a terrorist. But I'm willing to stand up for what I believe in.
Yeah, I think that this is also pretty context specific, right? So for my race and public policy class, like I have my students all go to community board meetings. And for them, it's an opportunity to assess how is that meeting welcoming people, right? So I think there's this yes and like, yeah, maybe the elections are rigged in a person's country and maybe they're not sort of into voting. And we also know that, like, as Janae mentioned, right, like voting doesn't get you all the things you need to, right? So I think it's a voting and conversation. And so one of the reasons I ask my students to go to these meetings is so that they can see, does this feel like a welcoming space, right? Is there language interpretation, right? Which there are various laws that require different kinds of language, accessibility. Like, are there these things in place to where if you were a regular community member and you wanted to go to this meeting and have your voice and have a space to raise your voice, do you feel welcome in that space, right? And so I think like we're working with the New York Open Coalition for Open Government right now with that class, so that we can assess what do the community board meetings, what do the council meetings look like right now. Because I think even the immigration subcommittee, which just met yesterday for the New York City for the council, the first meeting I went to, which was a month and a half ago, we're having this conversation about migrants, and the first 2 hours are questioning the emergency manager, which is great, right? Yes, this person should be held to account for what's going on. And then the second 2 hours were community-based groups giving testimony, right? I think what's missing in that space, though, is where are the migrants, right? And so it is this question of how does that space become a space where migrants who, and this was right after the Roosevelt Hotel, right? People sleeping outside at the Roosevelt Hotel. How do we create that space for them to be able to speak for themselves, right? And so I think that coming in from a place that, like, we disrupted plenty of city council meetings and shut them down, to here and really thinking about, like, does this place feel welcoming for people who are directly impacted, right? And I think that those are the things that I'm seeing, right, and encouraging my students to really think about, especially because I think with the current migrants that are coming, there are a large group that are Venezuelan who speak Spanish, and there was Spanish interpretation at that meeting, but there are also a lot of other people, right, who I think from Families for Freedom, there's folks who've been coming in who are French speakers, right, and so I think thinking about, like, does this match the population that we're trying to incorporate, and to what extent are we providing them the space to feel like this can be your place to own, right? Like, this feels like a welcoming place. And so I do think the sort of voting component, and I think if you're referring to one of the chapters in the book about, like, I had this reporter call me and be like, well, the Latinos didn't come out to vote on this very important issue. And I was just like, why would they? Like, it's not just up to the Latinos to change this policy, and that's like what one of the chapters is really focused on, is that white people brought this policy into place. Those white people should be the people who are actually changing the policy with direction from directly impacted Latino people, right? And so I think for me, coming from that context of, like, why would I feel comfortable in this all-white space? Like, for me, I knew that wasn't going to be the case, and so I didn't expect Latino voters to come out in large numbers to this election in that particular instance. And I don't expect the same thing here, right? I think it's challenging in a place like New York City, where we do have so many Black and brown people who are in those positions of power, but who may be distant from working class migrant communities, right? And not to say that they all aren't. I know there are plenty who are advocating for that, but it's challenging, right, to know that, like, we have people in these positions of power and they're not necessarily taking up the issue of inequality, right? Or obviously with the current conversations too, like, they're not really thinking about what does this look like that Black, brown people are the ones who are most targeted by what's happening in this moment.
And you mentioned the Roosevelt Hotel. We're having a press conference there on October the 24th from 10 to 1. So if you want to come down and see us in action, we're partnering up with Baji. Just come along, and I'll give you my cell phone number so you can call or text me and say, hey, Janae, I'm down, or if you know someone, so you can see us all in action. And we're also going to be dispersing, like, different goodies to the migrants. My cell phone number is 347-219-3254. Again, that's 347-219-3254. My email address is Janae, Janay, at families with the S, FOR, freedom.org. So you can contact me either way. And if you need help with anything, I don't care what it is, you can reach out to me. If I don't have it, I'll direct you in the right direction. And last but not least, if you have a friend that's in this, because we're in a college, and I know a lot of students here are probably undocumented, and the only income they may get is, like, from under the table, I would tell you to tell your friend, or if it's yourself, we can help them work on getting the elected officials, like, provide them with a private bill now so they can work on their legal status while they're still in school. And this way they can generate letters and stuff from their professors so they can adjust their status and not just graduate from college and just still be in limbo. Thank you.
One last week.
Yeah, real quick, a while ago I wrote a case brief on Black deportation and the treatment that they deal with regarding, like, their medical needs, and I want to know what your organization is doing
to help advocate for Black people in the incarceration system? Please, Rachel.
We are disturbing their peace. For example, with Garfield, Christiana, she takes all the props for it. She shopped his story around to the media, and he was in Chrome Detention Center, which is in Miami. And if you Google his name, you'll see him like standing up with one leg. So we just advocate for them. We call out the people that's not doing what they're supposed to do, and we try to get the media involved as much as possible in the elected officials. We do phone banking and telephone banking. What that looks like is if Mr. Smith is a deportation officer, we'll set up a time, say 2 o'clock on Monday morning, and everyone is calling Mr. Smith's office demanding that Garfield be treated the way he needs to be treated and things of that nature. And the purpose of that, those deportation officers and those officers are just looking to just abolish. They just want to just get rid of people. So we make it so that they can't do no work because they're constantly calling. And it works because Garfield was released from detention.
Okay, so we are out of time for tonight. We can thank our guests with a round of applause. Thank you both. We do have one more book talk this semester. Our fellow Dr. Erin Thompson will be reading from her book, or speaking on her book, Smashing Statues, which is about the recent trend of pulling down Confederate statues and other statues that are sort of insensitive to the racial legacy of this country. So please join us for that one. If you're on our list, I'll be getting emails about that. So please join us there as well. Thank you.
And tomorrow there is also a great talk by Sarah Tosh, who's coming from Rutgers Camden, but is a King Graduate Center grad, who will be talking about her new book, which has been out, I guess, about a week now. And I'm going to butcher the title because I don't have it in my... Nick, do you have the title more handy than I do? Nope, definitely not. But it is at 1:30 tomorrow. I think it's... Do you know where it is?
Immigration court start.
One more time?
Back to immigration court.
Yes, it is about immigration court. I know that. But it's in 1:30. I don't know where it is around here, though. Do you know?
The immigration law death penalty.
Immigration law death penalty, and it's about New York immigration courts. So definitely encourage folks to come join.
New building, 9.64. Skylight room, or Riverview room, up on the other side, 9th floor.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Sarah's a great friend and does mostly her work in New York. So definitely encourage folks. And thanks, Dan, so much. And thank you, Remy, for putting this together for us. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.